A Hafiza of the Quran, a young woman who spent her time in constant prayer and recitation, was considered pious and virtuous by everyone. However, when she passed away and her funeral procession reached the cemetery for burial, a horrifying event occurred that left everyone shaken with fear. As soon as the body was lowered into the grave, a snake emerged from within. People tried to chase it away, but the snake kept returning. Despite repeated attempts, burying her body seemed impossible. Witnessing this terrifying scene, people became anxious and started questioning why this was happening to such a devout woman. All eyes turned toward her husband, who stood silently amid the chaos. People asked him for answers, but he refused to reveal anything. Eventually, the crowd forced him to appear before the king. The king interrogated him sternly and demanded to know the truth. When the reality came to light, it sent shivers down everyone's spine. What was revealed was a mistake so grave that it not only nullified all the woman's acts of worship, but also subjected her to the torment of the grave. The weather was oppressive, heavy with humidity, making it difficult to breathe. The man sat on the floor eating his breakfast, sweating profusely. He had made a small piece of bread for himself. Having recently lost his job, he was deeply troubled. Still at home, he planned to quickly finish his meal and set out to find work. He ate hurriedly and finished half the bread in less than a minute. The bread was small, as he had almost run out of flour. He then stepped outside and visited a few shopkeepers, hoping to find work, but none were willing to hire him. Disheartened, he felt that he might have to endure days of hunger and deprivation. Frustrated and hopeless, he sat down in a random spot. Just then, two men passed by, talking about needing a laborer for their home. The man, who had some experience with such work, approached them and requested an opportunity. The two men agreed and took him to their home, explaining the tasks. The work was simple, and the man felt a sense of relief. At a time when despair had consumed him, Allah had provided a ray of hope. He began working with half of the task completed and half remaining. As he paused for a breath, he overheard two men talking outside. They seemed to be royal guards searching for someone. Soon, they knocked on the door of the house where he was working. Nervously, he opened the door. The guards asked if he knew the husband of the recently deceased Hafiza of the Quran. Shocked and terrified, he froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Though consumed by fear, he managed to maintain his composure, denying any knowledge. The guards left, and he quickly shut the door, taking deep breaths to calm himself. His mind raced with questions. What if they had recognized me? What would have happened? He couldn't think any further. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, the king was resting in his chamber when the queen informed him that the court was ready. Despite not feeling fully recovered, the king went to the court, knowing it was unusually crowded since it hadn't convened for 2 days. The court had been postponed because the king had been unwell. Although he was aware that many petitioners were eagerly waiting, his health had not permitted him to sit through the exhausting task of hearing and resolving issues. He had announced that court sessions would resume once he regained his strength, and now, 2 days later, he was ready. As the court proceeded, people came forward one by one to present their grievances. During this time, a soldier entered with a message. Although the interruption annoyed the king, he allowed the soldier to speak. The soldier informed him of the death of a Hafiza of the Quran from a prominent area of the kingdom, and requested permission to bury her in the cemetery near the royal palace. The king granted the request without hesitation, as the woman was known for her piety and righteousness. The cemetery was reserved for the most revered scholars and leaders of the time. The king had a tradition of attending the funerals of those buried in this cemetery, and he intended to honor this practice again. The burial was scheduled for the next morning. Knowing that tomorrow's royal court would be cancelled, the king instructed the soldier not to announce this until the usual court hour to avoid unnecessary gatherings near the palace. Permission was sought to bury her in the cemetery near the royal palace. The king granted permission because the woman was known for her piety and righteousness. There could be no objections to this. The cemetery was reserved for prominent scholars and leaders of the time. For this reason, whenever a funeral or burial took place there, the king would always attend. This time, too, the king intended to attend the funeral the next day, as it was his practice. People also assumed that everyone buried in that cemetery was righteous and virtuous. As such, the king made it a rule to always attend the funerals held there. The death of the Hafiza of the Quran had occurred that very day, and after obtaining permission, it was decided that she would be buried the next day. The burial was scheduled for after the morning hours. A soldier brought this information to the king, who acknowledged it with a nod. Now the king knew that the court would not convene the following day either. The king instructed the soldier not to announce the cancellation of the court immediately, but to wait until the court session was supposed to start. Otherwise, news of the king attending the burial might spread, drawing a large crowd to the cemetery, which the king wished to avoid. The sky was overcast, filled with clouds. Although it was morning, it felt like evening, as rain could start at any moment. People began making arrangements to protect themselves from unexpected weather conditions. The reason for this gathering was the funeral of a Hafiza of the Quran from a significant region of the kingdom, which was scheduled for the morning. A large crowd was slowly making its way toward the cemetery, carrying the coffin on their shoulders. Rainfall the previous night had left the ground wet and muddy, making the journey slippery. People walked carefully, fearing they might lose their footing. It seemed as if the entire kingdom had come together to attend this funeral. The woman had been incredibly virtuous, which explained the large attendance, and more people continued to join the procession. Now, the crowd was only a few miles away from the cemetery. They moved slowly to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to help carry the coffin and that those who had traveled from afar could participate fully. The news had spread throughout the kingdom. When the king learned of it, he decided to attend the funeral as well. To avoid being recognized, he disguised himself and set out to join the procession. The king maintained a distance from the crowd, ensuring no one recognized him. Wearing his disguise, he observed the people moving slowly toward the cemetery. He chose a different route, one that led to the cemetery via a secret passage from the palace. This secret path was often used by the king to patrol the kingdom in disguise, ensuring his true identity remained hidden. The king preferred to keep his movements and actions private. By the time the funeral procession reached the cemetery, the king was still a short distance away. The crowd had thinned considerably, as many people had returned after the funeral prayer, while others decided to proceed to the burial site. The grave had already been dug, and it was deep. The body was now ready to be lowered into the grave. A few men stepped forward to carry out the burial, but as they prepared to place the body into the grave, they suddenly backed away. The king, observing this from a distance, was puzzled. He moved closer to see what was happening and why the men were hesitating. Now, the previously thinned crowd began to grow again, as people from nearby areas joined to see what was happening. The king watched as the same 4 men stepped forward once more and attempted to lower the body into the grave, only to retreat again. The king could not understand why they were behaving this way and why they were delaying the burial. Curious, the king moved even closer to witness the scene. What he saw left him stunned. The men hesitated because a large snake was sitting inside the grave, its hood raised threateningly. The king immediately understood why the men kept backing away. The men explained that every time they attempted to lower the body into the grave, the snake would reappear. They mentioned that they had already tried to kill the snake twice and had successfully driven it away. However, every time they brought the body near the grave, the snake mysteriously reappeared. The crowd, including the king, was left bewildered. No one could understand how the snake kept returning to the grave or what it signified. Quite some time had passed, and the body still lay outside the grave. The king appeared deeply distressed, unable to understand why this was happening. What could be the reason? Such events were considered highly unusual, and they often led people to think negatively about the deceased, suspecting that their actions in life might have caused such occurrences. The king wanted to prevent such rumors and misunderstandings from spreading in his kingdom. He was determined not to let this incident foster doubt and mistrust among his people. To address the issue, the king once again encouraged the four men to muster their courage and try lowering the body into the grave one more time. The men had previously killed and driven away the snake in front of the king, and it had seemingly disappeared. However, as soon as they attempted to bury the body again, the snake mysteriously reappeared. The onlookers were now filled with fear, and many began to flee the scene. The crowd, which had initially been large, significantly thinned out as people left in terror. The king was deeply saddened. This was the burial of a Hafiza of the Quran, a woman of great virtue, which is why he had allowed her to be buried in that cemetery. However, this incident raised countless doubts and questions. Suddenly, it began to rain, and the remaining people started leaving the area. The king, too, decided to depart, but before leaving, he instructed the remaining individuals to try burying the body again once the rain stopped. He reasoned that the rain would likely cause the snake to retreat to its burrow, making it easier to complete the burial. After giving these instructions, the king returned to the palace. The people in the palace had no idea that the disguised figure among the crowd was the king himself. Back in his chambers, the king paced restlessly, anxious about whether the burial had taken place. He sent soldiers to gather updates on the situation. The night grew darker, and the king assumed that by now the burial must have been completed. To confirm, he dispatched soldiers to the cemetery to find out whether the body had been buried or if fear had driven people away, leaving the body unattended. The king needed answers to these questions. The soldiers, acting on the king's orders, arrived at the cemetery in the middle of the night. What they found left them deeply sorrowful. The body had not been buried and still lay outside the grave. The dirty rainwater and mud had soiled the shroud, making the scene even more heart-wrenching. Gathering their courage, the soldiers decided to attempt burying the body themselves. However, the grave had filled with water due to the rain. As they lowered the body into the grave, several snakes suddenly emerged from within. The body began to float in the water, as the grave was now completely waterlogged. The sight was both painful and horrifying. Realizing the futility of their efforts, the soldiers retrieved the body and placed it beside the grave. They then returned to the palace to inform the king of what had transpired. The soldiers described everything they had witnessed, including the multiple snakes that emerged from the grave. The king was pacing anxiously, awaiting their return. His worry was palpable. Never before had anyone seen him so distraught. Part of his concern stemmed from the fact that he had personally granted permission for the burial in this prestigious cemetery. He feared that if the situation was indeed related to the deceased's actions, it might tarnish the sanctity of the cemetery, where many righteous individuals had been buried. This thought weighed heavily on his mind. The queen attempted to console him, but her words failed to bring him any comfort. When the soldiers returned, they reported that the body was still lying outside the grave. They explained that every time they tried to bury it, the same snake reappeared, this time accompanied by many smaller snakes. The soldiers also mentioned that the grave was heavily waterlogged. Despite this, they had attempted to lower the body into the grave, only to be attacked by the snakes. They managed to drive the snakes away and retrieved the body, placing it back beside the grave. The waterlogged soil was too heavy to cover the grave properly, and they lacked the tools necessary to complete the burial. Reluctantly, they left the body outside the grave once more. Hearing this, tears welled up in the king's eyes. He had never witnessed such an event in his life, nor had he ever heard of such a thing. Not only had he seen this extraordinary situation with his own eyes earlier, but now the soldiers were recounting the same horrific details. The king was overwhelmed with grief and confusion. How could such a situation arise for a Hafiza of the Quran, a woman known for her piety? Why was the earth refusing to accept her body? Determined to uncover the truth, the king asked the soldiers who had been present at the cemetery during the burial attempts. The soldiers were uncertain about the identities of those present. The king instructed his soldiers to investigate the matter. The next morning, the soldiers informed him that the people present at the cemetery were distant relatives who had come to bury the woman. After the burial attempt, they had not returned to the cemetery. The king was astonished and questioned why it was not her close male relatives who performed the burial, as was customary. Furious, the king ordered that the woman's husband be brought to the palace immediately. The soldiers understood the importance of finding him, as he seemed to hold the key to understanding the entire situation. The woman had been married and lived in a region far from the capital with her husband. Upon investigation, it was discovered that her husband had been with her at the time of her death, but had not accompanied the funeral to the cemetery. This puzzled the king. Why had the woman's husband been absent from such an important occasion? This was highly unusual. How could the husband of such a virtuous and righteous woman not be present at her funeral? The king, deeply troubled, ordered his soldiers to announce that the woman's husband must be found and brought to his court. 2 days passed, but there was no trace of him. The soldiers were relentless in their search, eager to carry out the king's orders, but they could not locate him. During this time, the king secretly visited the cemetery again, taking no one with him. By now, 4 days had passed since the woman's death. When the king arrived at the cemetery, he was deeply saddened by what he saw. Tears welled up in his eyes as he gazed upon the body, still lying outside the grave. The shroud had turned completely black, soiled by rain, mud, and dirt. The king, overcome with emotion, approached the body with trembling hands and dragged it into the grave himself. As he did so, he noticed the snake reappear. This time, the king ignored it and began covering the grave with soil. No one had dared to attempt burying the body again, as they feared the snake. Many believed it was not an ordinary snake but a serpent of divine punishment. The reputation of the Hafiza of the Quran was tarnished, despite Allah's nature as the one who conceals faults. The king believed that there must be some divine wisdom behind this event, perhaps a lesson that Allah intended for humanity. The king returned to the palace with a heavy heart and locked himself in his chamber. The queen understood that it was best not to disturb him. The king was known for his kind and compassionate nature, and he deeply cared for his people. His concern for justice and the well-being of his subjects had earned him their love and respect. While the king appeared to rest in his chamber, his mind was consumed by the troubling incident. As he contemplated the matter, he drifted off to sleep. In his dream, he saw someone shaking him awake and pointing in a particular direction. Startled, the king looked toward where the figure was pointing. Before him, he saw a woman performing prayers. After completing her prayer, she picked up the Quran and began reciting it. As the king watched, the scene changed. Now, the woman was sitting and reciting tasbih, praising Allah with prayer beads. Suddenly, a cat approached her and sat nearby. The woman drove the cat away, striking it despite the fact that it had done her no harm. The king grew angry and moved toward her in the dream, intending to reprimand her for her unjust treatment of the innocent animal. However, before he could reach her, both the woman and the cat vanished. The king awoke from the dream, his heart pounding with confusion. Everything had disappeared. He sat up, taking deep breaths, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Lying back down, he reassured himself that perhaps the dream was meant to guide him toward understanding the matter more deeply. Nevertheless, the king felt the need to consult a wise mystic about the meaning of the dream. He frequently sought the mystic's interpretations for such dreams. Summoning the mystic to the palace, the king awaited his arrival. The mystic soon arrived and was brought to the king's chamber. The king narrated his dream in detail, along with the events that had occurred 2 days earlier. The mystic listened intently to the king's account. What the mystic said afterward left the king astonished. The mystic explained to the king that every act of Allah holds wisdom and purpose. Allah likely wanted to use the king as an instrument to accomplish something significant. The mystic's words strengthened the king's belief that this was all part of a greater plan. Without delay, the king ordered his soldiers to find the woman's husband as quickly as possible. He gave them 2 days to complete the task, and warned that the soldier who failed to locate the husband would be executed. This strict order reflected the gravity of the situation, leaving no room for negligence. Even the queen refrained from questioning the king's decision, recognizing the severity of the matter. The queen advised the soldiers on how to approach their search for the woman's husband. She suggested beginning by questioning neighbors about his appearance, writing down his description, and determining his possible whereabouts. She also recommended inquiring about his relatives and the places he frequently visited. The soldiers thanked the queen for her guidance and set out on their mission. While the soldiers searched for the husband of the Hafiza of the Quran, the king himself disguised himself and traveled to the area where the woman had lived. He wanted to personally gather information about her. Knocking on the doors of her neighbors, the king asked questions about her character. To his surprise, everyone spoke highly of her. The neighbors described her as a virtuous woman who was always engaged in prayers, Quran recitation, and supplication. She avoided idle talk, treated everyone with kindness, and rarely left her home. The king found it remarkable that no one had a single negative thing to say about her. Yet, despite these glowing accounts, the king couldn't reconcile this with the events at her funeral. Why had snakes repeatedly appeared at her grave? What had gone wrong? The king found himself lost in thought, trying to uncover the truth behind this mysterious occurrence. 10 days had passed, yet the mystery remained unsolved. The king grew more certain that only the woman's husband could reveal the truth. After all, he was the person closest to her, especially since her parents were no longer alive. The husband was the only one who could provide a complete picture. While the king trusted the accounts of the neighbors, he suspected there was something deeper being concealed. One question continuously plagued his mind. Why had Allah allowed such disgrace to befall this woman's body, exposing it to ridicule before so many people? This incident weighed heavily on the king, deeply affecting him. He ate and drank less, consumed by thoughts of unraveling the mystery. The root of his distress wasn't the woman's relation to him, but the recurring dreams that haunted him. The dreams seemed to hold some truth, and only the mystic could interpret their meaning. Meanwhile, the soldiers intensified their search. They were baffled as to why the woman's husband had seemingly vanished. Had he deliberately gone into hiding? Or was there another reason for his absence? The king, impatient with the lack of progress, assigned an entire battalion to the task, dispersing them across different regions. The soldiers were instructed to patrol day and night, gathering every possible lead about the man. With the description of the husband collected from the neighbors, the search became slightly more focused. The king eagerly awaited the day when his soldiers would bring him the news that they had located the man. 2 more days passed without any updates. The king clung to hope, confident that good news would arrive soon. The soldiers, carrying an enormous responsibility, left no stone unturned in their search. They scoured every corner of the kingdom, checking every house where they thought they might find the husband of the Hafiza of the Quran. Despite their tireless efforts, the soldiers grew weary and discouraged. The battalion, which had been split into smaller groups to cover more ground, eventually regrouped in one location. None of them had succeeded in finding the man. They had searched the 4 corners of the kingdom but found no trace of him. The soldiers, now frustrated and demoralized, sat together to devise a new plan. However, they were inwardly terrified of returning to the palace without fulfilling their mission. They knew they would face the king's wrath. At this moment, the battalion was stationed in a mountainous region. The soldiers searched every house in the area, but their efforts yielded nothing. Evening was approaching, the sun was setting, and soon darkness would envelop the region. If night fell, the search would become even more challenging, and they feared another failure. The battalion had just sat down to rest for a few moments when they saw a man descending the mountain. The man was a shepherd, returning home with his goats. The soldiers spotted him from afar, and 2 of them approached him. The shepherd appeared nervous, perhaps because he had noticed the soldiers. The soldiers, exhausted from their long search, decided to adopt a new strategy. They mentally revisited the description of the man they were looking for: tall stature, well-built, brown eyes, and a lightly bearded face. Another distinct feature was a large mole on his hand. When the soldiers reached the shepherd, they were astonished to find that he matched the description perfectly. Now, only one identifying mark remained to be confirmed. As the soldiers enthusiastically shook his hand, his sleeve lifted slightly, revealing the mole. The soldiers were now convinced that this was the husband of the Hafiza of the Quran. They told the shepherd that the king required the services of a shepherd in the palace. Hearing this, the shepherd's face lit up with joy, and he readily agreed to accompany them. The soldiers signaled to the rest of the battalion that their search was over. They learned that the man had been tending goats deep in the mountains, which is why he had remained hidden. The shepherd confirmed that his wife had recently passed away and that he lived alone. Satisfied with their discovery, the soldiers began their journey back to the palace with the shepherd. When they arrived at the magnificent palace, the shepherd was awestruck. Never in his life had he seen such grandeur. However, the king was visibly furious with the man. His mind was filled with questions, but before asking them, he wanted to punish the shepherd for wasting the time of the king and his soldiers. Without saying a word, the king ordered the soldiers to imprison the shepherd. The soldiers realized that they had encountered the shepherd earlier, but he had concealed his identity. This revelation only fueled the king's anger, and he ordered that the shepherd be kept in the dungeon without food or water for 2 days, as a lesson in the consequences of deceit. 2 days later, the shepherd was brought before the king in a weakened state. The king admonished him, stating that he should now understand the gravity of lying and wasting others' time. The shepherd admitted his mistake and expressed remorse for his actions. The king then ordered that he be provided with proper care to recover from the effects of hunger and thirst. The next day, the shepherd was summoned before the king again. This time, the king informed him about the strange events that had occurred at the funeral of his wife and asked if he had any knowledge about them. The shepherd shook his head and replied that he knew nothing. The king warned him that he must answer all questions truthfully from now on, and the shepherd agreed. The king began by asking if the shepherd had a good relationship with his wife. The shepherd's response surprised the king. He said no. The king then asked why he had not attended his wife's funeral. The shepherd silently stared at the king before revealing something that left everyone in the room astonished. He said that he had divorced his wife shortly before her death. Because of this, he did not attend her burial, as she was no longer his legal wife, and thus no longer permissible for him to accompany. The shepherd added that, even as a matter of humanity, he had chosen not to attend, as he was conflicted. On one hand, he felt guilt for ending a relationship that had lasted so many years, but on the other, he felt that her behavior had left him no choice but to divorce her. The king's curiosity deepened. He asked the shepherd to elaborate on what kind of person the woman had been. The shepherd began by saying that his wife was a hafiza of the Quran, a pious and righteous woman whom everyone admired. But then he added, she was not a woman loved by Allah. This statement shocked everyone, including the king. The shepherd continued, explaining that his wife had disobeyed him and failed to fulfill his rights. She spent her days in constant prayer, performing obligatory prayers, followed by additional voluntary prayers, and then immersed herself in the recitation of the Quran. Whatever free time she had after her prayers, she spent in reciting tasbih, praising Allah, and engaging in remembrance of Allah. After that, she would rest. In her life, I felt as though I had no importance. She never gave me any time, not even to fulfill my marital rights. I had to repeatedly ask for what was my due, and this pained me deeply. She would respond by saying, I will miss my prayer, or I am not used to bathing with cold water. I made arrangements to heat water for her, despite being a poor man with no proper facilities. I burned wood to keep the house warm and even heated water for her on the fire. But such occasions happened perhaps once or twice in 6 months. As he narrated his story, the man broke into tears. I married her because of her piety and righteousness, but I ended up filled with regret. She devoted her entire day to worshiping Allah. Though she would complete other household tasks, she disobeyed me. She never gave me her time, even when I called for her. She made excuses and avoided me. She attained a high status in fulfilling the rights of Allah, but she completely failed in fulfilling the rights of people. She didn't even have a moment to ask me if I had eaten or how I was feeling. She never cared where I was going, who I was meeting, or how I spent my time. Her only concern was prayer, Quran recitation, and tasbih. It's true that every Muslim should be attached to these acts of worship, but Allah placed humans on this earth to live among others, to be companions to one another. If someone neglects their spouse to this extent, treating them as little more than a name on paper, what space will be left in that spouse's heart for love? How can a husband give affection when he receives none in return? How can he offer respect when he is treated with disregard? All I received from her was indifference. I accepted it as my fate, but even so, the whispers of Satan tempted me. Many times, I felt like turning to the wrong path to find solace with other women, but I restrained myself, repeatedly fighting my desires. I cried silent tears during the nights, while she remained engrossed in seeking Allah's pleasure. She succeeded in pleasing Allah, but failed to follow His command that says an obedient wife is beloved to Allah. My prayers were often filled with pleas for her understanding. O Allah, grant my wife the wisdom to listen to my needs. I could have married another woman, but I lacked the means. I was already struggling to make ends meet, and adding another marriage would have left both wives deprived. I feared the day of judgment, where Allah would surely hold me accountable for any injustice between my wives. To control my desires, I began fasting regularly. This practice saved me from many sins. But patience has its limits. On the day she passed away, I asked her for my marital right. As usual, she refused, and made the excuse of needing to bathe. My heart shattered completely. In that moment of despair, I divorced her. Just a short while later, she passed away. I was devastated, consumed by guilt that my divorce might have caused her death. That's why I hid from people, fearing they would find out the truth. The man fell silent after revealing all of this. Now, the reason behind Allah's punishment on the woman's grave became clear to everyone. It was because, although she pleased Allah, she blatantly ignored one of His key commands. She had disobeyed her husband and caused him great pain. The snakes that appeared in her grave were a manifestation of Allah's anger because she had failed to fulfill the rights of her spouse, despite her devotion to worship. She had attained what seemed like a high spiritual rank in the eyes of people, but she had neglected her responsibilities toward others, especially her husband. The king now fully understood the woman's story. He sought advice from the mystic on the next steps and decided to keep the man in his court. Eventually, the king arranged for the man to marry one of the queen's maids. The man's patience and perseverance were rewarded with a new, fulfilling life. He was immensely grateful to the king, whose kindness and wisdom had given him another chance at happiness. The king told the man that his reward was the result of his patience. Now, the king had to take the next step. For this purpose, he opened the rear section of the palace to the public and announced that he would address all his subjects. An invitation was sent to everyone, noble and common alike. The king made his way to the other side of the palace, where a massive crowd had gathered. Addressing the assembly, the king revealed the truth about the recent events involving the Hafiza of the Quran. The king had especially invited all the women of the kingdom, as his message was primarily directed toward them. He said that the incident carried a profound lesson for all women, and that perhaps Allah had allowed this woman's flaws to be exposed so that others might learn from her mistakes. The king reminded everyone that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had emphasized the importance of fulfilling the rights of others, with a special focus on a wife's obedience to her husband. He recounted the words of the Prophet, peace be upon him. If it were permissible in Islam for one person to prostrate to another, I would have commanded the wife to prostrate to her husband. The king explained that a husband does countless favors for his wife, and if a wife obeys her husband in recognition of these favors, she becomes beloved to Allah. He stressed that even if a woman is extremely devout, praying all day and worshiping all night, if she disobeys her husband, all her acts of worship are rendered meaningless. A woman who fails to fulfill her husband's rights, who disobeys him, and who disregards his needs cannot find favor with Allah, no matter how much she worships or prays. The king continued, her life will not flourish, and her afterlife will be destroyed. The example of the Hafiza of the Quran is clear. While she was devout in her prayers, fasting, and acts of remembrance, she failed in her duties as a wife. She fasted, even observed voluntary fasts, and engaged in constant remembrance of Allah, but she disobeyed her husband. In the end, this disobedience led to her disgrace. Not only was her disobedience revealed after her death, but Allah also chose not to conceal her flaws. Her actions became an example for all women to reflect upon. From this day forward, I urge all women not only to seek Allah's pleasure, but also to seek the pleasure of their husbands. Do not make excuses or refuse your husband without a valid Islamic reason. Such behavior will only lead to sin and make you deserving of Allah's punishment. What I am saying is not my own opinion. These are the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. We must adhere to these teachings. I implore every woman who may be harboring grievances or discord in her marriage to reconcile with her husband today, right now. Apologize, make amends, and become obedient to him. If you do this, I assure you, your life will become peaceful in this world, and you will achieve success in the hereafter as well." As the king looked at the crowd, he saw tears in the eyes of every woman present. It was clear that each woman, in some way or another, had faltered in fulfilling her husband's rights. The king's sermon had opened their eyes in us and made them reflect deeply on their behavior. At last, the king felt at peace. The interpretation of his dream had been fulfilled. Allah had chosen him for this task, and he had accomplished it with sincerity and resolve.